Good day. As I said a short while ago in another video, 2021 is turning out to be an exceptionally rich year in military technological terms. And it has been, in fact, Russia which has been doing most of the running. We've seen the final tests of the Zircon anti-ship missile. We've seen increasing signs that the Poseidon submarine nuclear-powered drone is now nearing the point where it will be entering service, with the first submarine capable of carrying it, the Belgorod, now launched and going through its final tests. We've seen that the Yasen submarine that I discussed a short while ago is also now entering service in increasing numbers. The Russians have just launched the fourth in the series. And of course, we've also been reading about all kinds of other developments with fighter jets and all of that. Now, I should stress that it is not just the Russians who are ramping up their military technological developments, that one gets the sense that some things of similar importance and significance are probably happening in China too. And the United States also undoubtedly has its own programs, especially to develop hypersonic glide vehicles of the sort that the Russians have now brought into service with the Avant-Garde vehicle, but probably there are other systems that the United States also has planned or in the pipeline also. The reason I focus more on Russian developments is firstly because it does seem as if the Russians have actually managed to gain some sort of a lead in military technology developments over the last few years. Putin himself has actually bragged about the fact, but also because the Russians are much more forthcoming at the moment about their weapons developments than other powers are. This contrasts with the situation during the Cold War, when we knew a great deal about the kind of weapon systems that the United States was busy developing and designing, but we knew virtually nothing about the Soviet ones until suddenly they might appear either in a Red Square parade or in some other form. So if I focus a little more on Russian developments than on American developments and Chinese developments, as I said, partly because the Russians are at the moment both, it seems, at the forefront of weapons development, but also because they're talking about their developments more. And the latest system that they're now talking about is the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile system, which is apparently likely to enter production in 2022 and may be deployed in service that year also. I should stress the word may, because the Russians have a history of claiming that weapons are ready for deployment when they are not, and I suspect that 2022 is an over-optimistic deadline for the entry into service of the Sarmat missile system. It still has some way to go in its development, but it does look as if that development is now almost at an end, and we will be seeing it deployed in service reasonably soon, perhaps not in 2022, but at some point before 2025. Now, why is this important? After all, intercontinental ballistic missile systems are hardly new. They have existed in some form since the 1950s, when, by the way, the first land-based intercontinental ballistic missile was deployed by the Soviets in the 1950s. This was the R-7 missile, which was developed by the famous designer Sergei Korolyov, which by most accounts was not a particularly effective or successful intercontinental ballistic missile. It took far too long to fuel up and to be made ready for launch, but it did provide the major space rocket that enabled the Soviets to pioneer the exploration of space in the 1950s and the 1960s, launching systems like the Sputnik 1 artificial satellite, the world's first artificial satellite, and Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, who was, by the way, launched into space the year I was born. So the intercontinental ballistic missiles have existed for a long time. Land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, I should stress. But it is also fair to say that they do seem to be now entering into a new technological level of a sort that we have not seen before. And that's perhaps not entirely surprising that it is the Russians who seem to be taking the lead in developing and designing these weapon systems, because during the Cold War, whilst the United States focused on launching its long-range strategic missiles from its submarines, the Ohio class and others, the Russians, the Soviets at that time, preferred to focus their strategic missile deterrent force on land. They did, of course, have sea-launched ballistic missiles like the US did, but the predominant part of the Soviet missile, a strategic missile deterrent, was always land-based in a way that is not true of the United States. And the result is that the Soviets have, first the Soviets and now the Russians, have invested very heavily in land-based missile development. The reason that has happened, by the way, has a great deal to do with geography and population density. It is very controversial in the United States to try and create places where one has large numbers of strategic missiles based. People don't like it for entirely understandable reasons. They fear that they're going to be made the primary target in a potential superpower war. And besides, there's all the inconveniences that come along with having a massive nuclear missile base fielding long-range strategic missiles close to your town or village or city. By contrast, Russia, with its gigantic uninhabited or barely inhabited areas, simply doesn't have that problem. And it's entirely straightforward for the Russians to plant their big missiles all over Russian territory in various parts of their country, some of them in the far north, but mainly, it should be said, in the western regions of their country and along the Trans-Siberian Railway, where they can be deployed without people being too bothered about it. So geography and no doubt the political systems, the fact that in the Soviet period, if you did have a missile base built near your town, there wasn't very much you could do about it, have no doubt played a part in explaining why the Soviets and now the Russians have focused so much on strategic missile developments on land. And there is another difference between US and Russian and previously Soviet strategic missile developments, which is that the United States, which in the 1960s undoubtedly had a more advanced chemical industry than the Soviets did, focused very early on solid fuel rockets, which are smaller and lighter and easier to handle and easier to store, whereas the Russians, the Soviets in the 50s and 60s, tended to build much bigger missiles which were liquid fueled. And initially, that did give the United States a significant advantage because liquid-fueled missiles had to be fueled up before launch, whereas solid-fueled missiles, like the ones the United States used, the Minuteman series of missiles in the United States, were able to be on station. They could be kept with much lesser maintenance and already fueled and ready to launch at any time. But, however, at some point in the late 1960s, the Soviets developed liquid-fueled missile systems where the liquid fuels were less volatile and less toxic and could be held contained within silos. These are underground launch craters, if you like, which can be specially hardened to resist an attack, and that they could be, these missiles, these liquid-fueled missiles, could be kept in these silos, fully fueled up, ready to launch, and kept in special conditions, presumably cold conditions, which meant that the fuel was kept stable. And there are apparently advantages in liquid-fueled missiles, which to some extent, or indeed to a great extent, offset the advantages that are provided by solid fuel systems. Firstly, I take this from open sources, since I'm not an engineer or a technologist or a chemical engineer of any kind, but it seems that liquid-fueled rockets tend to have faster acceleration, which makes them more difficult to intercept, and they can carry heavier payloads than solid-fueled rockets can. So they can be made bigger, they are more powerful, they have longer ranges, and they are faster. And the Sarmat missile system that is apparently going to enter service takes that to an extreme. Now, I say that it is a replacement for an earlier missile system, the Voyvoda, the R-36 Voyvoda, which entered service in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and which was previously the biggest and most powerful liquid-fueled ICBM in the world, and has remained so up to this day. It is a replacement of that system, and it seems to have similar dimensions to the Voyvoda, but because of advances in chemical technologies, its rocket fuels make it much more powerful than the Voyvoda was, increasing its range very substantially. And we've had a flurry of comments about it from various Russian officials. Let's go first of all to Dmitry Rogozin, who is the head of Roscosmos, that's Russia's equivalent to NASA, the agency that operates the Russian space program. He gave an interview with Soloviev Live YouTube, the YouTube channel on Saturday, and he said the following: "In fact, we are completing ground trials of all systems. Never before has Russia created an ICBM of this kind. So apparently it is almost ready for deployment and development." And we also learned from Rogozin's interview and from other places that it is in fact a very powerful system indeed. Some of its characteristics were recently disclosed. They were disclosed last year. We learn that the missile weighs 208 tons, which is almost the same as the Voyvoda system, that its payload is close to 10 tons, that its fuel, when fully tanked up, weighs 178 tons, and that it has a range of 18,000 kilometers. Now, it is the size of its payload, 10-ton payload, and its range that make the Sarmat different. Now, the Voyvoda, which it replaces, could apparently carry 10 independently targeted warheads. The Sarmat can carry 18 warheads. And apparently the range difference is 11,000 kilometers for the Voyvoda, sufficient to reach the United States across the North Pole. But the Sarmat has a much longer range, 18,000 kilometers. And Putin has said that this enables Sarmat to hit any target in the world. It can apparently cross not just the North Pole, but also the South Pole, and hit the United States coming towards the United States from the south. And apparently it does that without actually entering full Earth orbit. It is not a space weapon. It remains in the very highest stratosphere, but it is able to operate and reach any part of the world at extraordinary speeds. Mach 25 has been mentioned, crossing both poles if it needs to do so. So the United States obviously has most of its radar systems and its early warning systems in the northern parts of the United States, because it has assumed that any attack by Soviet missiles or Russian missiles would come from the north, but now it has to face the possibility that it may also come from the south. And of course, not only do we have a significant increase in payload with the ability to carry 18 independently targeted warheads in place of 10 for the Voivode, but it seems that the Sarmat is also able to carry hypersonic glide vehicles like the Avant-Garde vehicle, which the Russians have already deployed on some of their lighter, less powerful ICBMs, which are currently housed in silos. Now, the point about hypersonic glide vehicles is that they can maneuver at astonishing speeds, also apparently Mach 25, in the higher atmosphere, and they can also maneuver, making them extremely difficult to intercept, both as using any ground-launched or even, I understand, space-launched anti-missile defense system. And in fact, the entire Sarmat system seems to be geared towards defeating anti-ballistic missile systems, such as those that the United States has now been talking about deploying in Europe. It apparently accelerates very fast after it is launched, making it extremely difficult to intercept by a ground-launched anti-ballistic missile system launched from Eastern Europe. And of course, if it does launch a hypersonic glide vehicle, a maneuvering vehicle, when it approaches its target, that makes it even more difficult to intercept, or also closer to the target which it is going to reach. I would add that not only does the Sarmat perhaps and potentially carry hypersonic glide vehicles, but of course it's already very difficult to intercept large numbers of independently launched missile warheads launched by a missile of this sort. And of course the Voivode will also carry decoy warheads, which would also confuse a ground-based or indeed even a space-based ballistic missile system, anti-ballistic missile system. So this is a very powerful weapon indeed. And I'm going to make a prediction that having taken such a long time to develop it, the Russians are most unlikely to agree to bargain it entirely away. I suspect that in any talks that do take place with the United States, the Russians will insist on keeping the Sarmat itself in service, but they will perhaps agree that it shouldn't carry certain types of warhead, like hypersonic glide vehicles, in order to calm the United States and to achieve some degree of strategic stability. So that does, it seem to me, amount to a possible concession the Russians might make in strategic defense negotiations with the United States, but they will, of course, in return demand analogous concessions from the United States, probably in the form of the United States agreeing to scrap some of its anti-ballistic missile defense systems in Europe, in Korea, and in other places. Well, we will see what happens. Personally, I don't have much hope of these negotiations, these strategic negotiations, which are currently taking place between the Russians and the Americans, and which started in Geneva on the 28th of July. And as far as I can tell, the talks are still only at an exploratory stage. I don't have much hope or faith in them. I don't think most people do. I don't think the United States is agreement capable, as the Russians say. And I don't think we're going to see any major agreements achieved. But regardless, the Sarmat does provide the Russians with an important bargaining chip if a negotiation does take place, and one that is so important and which gives them so much leverage that I don't believe that they will dispense with it completely. So here we are. We now have a very impressive lineup of Russian ground-based weapon systems. We're going to have the Sarmat liquid-fueled, very powerful, very fast missile, able to carry warheads from Russia itself, capable of striking any part of the United States from the north or the south, depending on how the Russians decide to launch it. And it is going to be complemented by the road mobile ICBMs, which are solid fueled, which the Russians already possess in significant quantities, specifically the Yars missile, which carries 3 warheads and which is replacing the Topol, which we have just been informed by the Russians will be taken out of service in 2025. So the Russians have what is increasingly beginning to look like a credible land-based deterrent system. And this is now complemented by a reasonably credible, or at least we're led to think reasonably credible, anti-ballistic missile defense system in Russia, the A235 system in and around Moscow, and the S-500 missile system, which I discussed in a recent video, which could conceivably defend the silos at which the Sarmat system will be based. And this is now also complemented by an increasingly impressive sea-launched strategic missile deterrent, the Bulava missile system, launched from Borei class ballistic missile nuclear-powered submarines, which is also said to be extremely fast, which uses an interesting mix of solid and liquid-fueled technologies, and which apparently can strike its target using very shallow launch angles, making it very difficult to intercept, and operating, functioning at extremely high speed. Again, I stress, I'm no sort of technologist or scientist or engineer, but I am told that just as the Sarmat is a generation ahead of other liquid-fueled land-based missile systems like the Voivode, and the Yars is also apparently a very advanced land-based missile system, so the Bulava is apparently a whole stage, a whole generation ahead of other comparable missile systems, sea-launched ballistic missiles deployed by other powers, including the Trident missile system, which is still the missile system deployed on US Navy submarines. So the Russians, over the last 20 years, seem to have updated and modernized their land-based and sea-based deterrent forces to a very considerable degree, and this is gradually being complemented by upgrades to their aircraft-based, their bomber-based deterrent also. We learned that there's a new bomber, a new stealth bomber coming into service in Russia in a few years, Very little is known about it. And again, we need to be cautious about how quickly the Russians will indeed deploy these systems. And it's important to stress that the Americans and the Chinese also have stealth bomber programs. The Americans, of course, already deploy stealth bombers, but the programs that they probably have coming into service are probably more advanced than the Russians. But the Russians have the advantage in that apparently their stealth bombers will be operating a hypersonic long-range strategic cruise missile, the KH-95, which again the United States doesn't have at the moment. It doesn't have an equivalent. And last but not least, we have that deeply destabilizing and very disturbing Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone system that I discussed in a video some weeks ago. So a very impressive lineup of weapons coming on stream from the Russians. What are the Americans doing in response? Well, apparently there is talk in the United States of finally replacing the Minuteman III solid-fueled missile system, which has soldiered on in ever-upgraded forms since the 1970s. There have been previous attempts to replace it with other systems, other missiles, but all of them have failed. And I gather that the latest plans to develop a replacement for the Minuteman III are unsurprisingly once again eliciting considerable controversy. And we also learn and hear about a submarine launched system based on the new Columbia submarine. I suspect that that's a much more advanced, at least a system much more likely to see reality than the replacement of the Minuteman III. So the United States still is able to maintain its nuclear defense force, its strategic defense force, at a considerable level. And last but not least, we also learned that the United States, this is something we learned some years ago, that the United States has carried out developments to its nuclear fuses, and that apparently gives its warheads a speed advantage over those of other powers, though I strongly suspect that the Russians have also been doing comparable work to the Americans in the field of nuclear fuses also. So at the moment, it does look as if the Russians have, as I said, stolen a march on the Americans in terms of strategic deterrent forces. Why has this happened? I'm going to make a guess, and I think that there's two underlying causes. Firstly, after the end of the Cold War, the United States assumed that it had conclusively won the strategic arms race with the Soviets and with the Russians, and that the Russians would never be able to deploy new weapon systems to replace those that it had left, that were, the Soviet legacy weapons left over from the Cold War, and that gradually and incrementally the Russian strategic defense force would deteriorate and decline. So there was very little incentive in the United States in the 1990s and the 2000s and even the 2010s to gradually do anything much to replace the legacy systems left over from the Cold War. The United States was confident that it would gradually achieve an overwhelming dominance because the Soviet deterrent force, still controlled by Russia, would eventually deteriorate and fall apart. And a second reason, I believe, is that the United States overinvested in anti-ballistic missile technology. I think that the United States convinced itself that anti-ballistic missile systems would be a strategic game changer and that it would be able to install anti-ballistic missile systems in its warships, its Arleigh Burke destroyers, and in Europe, and that these would be more than enough to counter what they expected would be a declining and diminishing Russian missile and strategic deterrent. And I think that a lot of time and a lot of energy was spent trying to develop these anti-ballistic missile systems, and that has, I think, turned out to be a major mistake, a major diversion of funds and of technological skills away from the weapon systems which ultimately really matter, with the Russians effortlessly, or to all appearances effortlessly, overtaking and surpassing American anti-ballistic missile technologies by fielding a whole bewildering range of strategic missile systems which the United States never expected that they would do. And then, of course, there is a third reason, which I think is a geopolitical one, which is that, of course, starting in 2001, the United States became unduly focused on waging its war on terror and on trying to reorganize the Middle East, a massive waste of investment and resources to achieve, as it has turned out, extremely little. And in recent years, it has become fully absorbed with the conflict in the Pacific against China, which is going to start absorbing ever larger amounts of US tax dollars and indeed even printed dollars, which we see being churned out in the United States like there is no tomorrow. So as a result of all of this, the United States took its eye off the ball, and it allowed the Russians to gain this lead over the United States, which is something that never happened during the Cold War, when it was the United States that was always in the lead when it came to strategic forces, but which is something that the United States has allowed to slip away. Now, the United States, of course, does have the technological and engineering and industrial abilities to match everything that the Russians are doing. Nobody should be in any doubt about that. The United States remains the world's forefront scientific and technological superpower, and if it did invest the necessary amount of dollars and scientific resources and expertise in matching the Russians and indeed surpassing the Russians, I have no doubt that in time it would do so. It would take time. At the very least, it would take 10 years. And of course, by then, the Russians would no doubt be deploying and fielding more systems. But over time, inevitably, greater American resources would start to count. The problem is, though the resources that the United States can throw at this problem exceed those which Russia can, the United States has got itself into a situation where it is overcommitted around the world. This is a point which I have discussed many times, but which it bears repeating. All of these bases that the United States has around the world, all these huge fleets of super carriers that it deploys, and of course the Pacific arms race, the naval arms race that it is gradually becoming absorbed into with the Chinese in the Pacific, all of that is going to take up time, resources, mental energy, engineering skills, engineering resources, industrial resources, which in other circumstances, say in the 1970s, the United States could have used instead to match these Russian developments. And I understand that there is already a report, a congressional report, which is saying with growing alarm that the United States is finding that the cost of replacing or matching the other two superpowers, the other two military superpowers, China and Russia, in military technology terms and in strategic terms, is becoming excessive. and that expectations that the US, a strategic deterrent, could be upgraded at minimal cost are proving wrong, and that costs are in fact spiraling out of control. By the way, that does not surprise me, because of course the other problem that the United States has, and I'm not going to discuss it in this program, is that unlike the Russians, and one suspects the Chinese, it has lost control of the cost base of its military developments, as we have seen capture by the private companies, Raytheon, Lockheed, and the rest, which produce these weapons and which see the US government as a fat milk cow that they can squeeze milk out of as they please. The famous military-industrial complex that we hear so much about and which does most emphatically exist. So it seems to me that the United States is facing, here again, in this area, a commitments crisis. It cannot do all of these things that it is doing at the moment at once. If it does, it risks falling behind in all sorts of weapon systems. It's going to struggle, for example, in my opinion, to counter the Sarmat system that we've just been talking about on this program. And of course, it's also now got to consider all sorts of other systems. It's got to consider the Poseidon anti-submarine, the Poseidon submarine drone, the Burst-Venik nuclear-powered cruise missile, the KH-95 cruise missile that the Russians may be launching from their bombers, which is hypersonic. It's got to worry about the YARS land-based system. It's got to worry about the increasing numbers of Chinese strategic nuclear weapon systems that Global Times bragged about in that editorial that I spoke about, in which I discussed these developments a few days ago. And of course, it's also now got to worry about another nuclear power that's appeared on the scene, North Korea, which obviously does not have systems that can remotely compare in technological prowess to those that the Russians are fielding, but which nonetheless is a nuclear power with ICBMs that can apparently hit parts of the United States, and whose mere possession of nuclear weapons must be complicating to an extraordinary degree US nuclear strategic missile planning and the US nuclear strategic ballistic missile defense planning also. So what does the United States do in this situation? Well, of course, it could do what I discussed. It could increase the resources it has to try and match the problem. It still has enough resources, as I said, to take on Russia on its own. Does it have enough resources to take on Russia and China and North Korea on its own? Well, I doubt it, frankly. But, I mean, it could try. It could increase its defense budget even further. It could divert more of its industrial production and manufacturing capability to producing more of these weapon systems. It could get its scientists in its universities, some of the best scientists in the world, working ever more to develop more systems like that. But of course, if it does that, then it runs, it seems to me, two risks. Firstly, it probably creates ever more problems with the financial structures of the United States. Already the United States is running a 15% budget deficit. Already the United States is having to electronically create money to cover its bills. Already we are seeing some of the consequences of that in the United States also. But the other thing is, the more weapons, the more time, the more energy is produced building weapons, the more factory space, the more production capability is diverted to weapon systems, to building weapon systems, as opposed to civilian production, building consumer goods for American consumers to buy. and of course world consumers to buy, that increases American trade deficits. It puts further pressure on the dollar. It weakens the American position in world markets. It causes all sorts of problems of a sort which the United States, by the way, previously faced in the 1960s, and which drove it off the gold standard at that time when it was trying to pay for the space race, the Vietnam War, the Great Society program, and the arms race with the Soviets all at the same time. But it's going to come again on this occasion with an even greater force and with an even greater challenge, given China's much greater industrial and manufacturing capability. So it seems to me that the only sensible and wise choice that the United States can follow, and it's becoming now a consistent theme of these programs that I do, is to retrench, to draw back, to scale down what it is doing, to accept, for example, that the Middle East is not vitally important for the United States, and that it really doesn't need to have large numbers of troops there, and it doesn't gain anything by meddling continuously in the internal affairs of these countries. It can also scale down in Europe. It can accept, for example, that Ukraine is not of decisive importance to the United States, as some people insist that it is. It can come to agreements with the Russians about not extending NATO further. It can put a stop to its anti-ballistic missile deployments in Europe. It can do all sorts of things there. And I've discussed in recent programs all the things it could do to come to some kind of an agreement with China also in the Pacific. And it could agree limits on weapon systems, both conventional, especially naval, and nuclear. And I still think that the Russians and the Chinese, despite the massive deficit of trust which now exists, would probably agree to some kind of limits, if only in their own interests. Both China and Russia, after all, have many other things they could be doing with their tax RMB and tax rubles than building more of these systems. And I'm sure that that's what they would do if they were given the opportunity to do so. The problem is that the political situation in the United States makes all this extraordinarily difficult. And to be frank, and just to say again what I said at the outset of this program, I don't think realistically it's going to happen. Apparently there's already talk of now expelling another 60 Russian diplomats in September. This is just a few weeks after the President of the United States and the President of Russia met and had talks about predictability and stability in their relations in Geneva. Whenever there are any moves to try to retrench, to agree limits, to try to pursue more realistic policies, hardliners invariably assert themselves in the military industrial complex, in the foreign NGO community, the foreign policy community, amongst the neocons, in the intelligence agencies, wherever. And this always seems to be this idea, this belief that has gained enormous traction amongst some people in the United States, that if the United States were to make any concessions, if it were to draw back, if it were to retreat in any area, that would somehow be a betrayal of what the United States is and represents, and that this is something which cannot be countenanced. I have to say that I do not understand the latter thinking. It is goes completely against the traditional foreign policy traditions of the United States, but it does seem to be how many Americans, at least in the level of policy, think. Well, all I can say is that if things continue as they are, the Russians will indeed be building more and more of these sort of systems. And to come back now to the topic of the Sarmat missile, we learned that Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, visited Krasmash, the factory in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, which is going to build these weapons. And I read this on the Russian Defense Ministry's website. The Krasnoyarsk machine building plant is ready to implement a long-term contract for supplying the armed forces of the Russian Federation with new intercontinental ballistic missiles, Sarmat, said Minister of Defense of Russia, General of the Army, Sergei Shoigu, on Friday. The minister visited Krasmash on Friday to inspect the production workshops of the establishment and to hear the report of its administration. We have just reviewed all the issues related to the new types of armament. We have examined the readiness of Krasmash to implement the long-term contract for one of the most formidable armaments that our country has to possess. It is the missile Sarmat. We are totally confident that the Krasmash will complete the assigned tasks, said the minister at the meeting with the employees of the factory. Shoigu, by the way, by training, is a civil engineer. He was a former project manager, so presumably when he goes to a place like Krasmash, he knows what he's talking about when he talks like this. So these weapon systems that we're talking about, Sarmat and all the rest, are for real. They're going to enter into production. They're going to increase in number and quantity and sophistication. And I predict that in 5-10 years' time, the United States is going to be faced with a crisis the like of which it has never seen. Probably at that point, wiser counsels will finally prevail, and we will see some genuine negotiation take place, but that will be from a far weaker position than the one the United States has now. Well, there it is. I'm obviously not in charge of American foreign policy. I speak about all of this with sorrow and concern. I fear that the situation in the Pacific is spiraling out of control, and I fear that all kinds of mistakes are being made. But as I said, the decisions are not mine. I can only say what I read and explain how it all looks to me. And lastly, I will finish this program by explaining what Sarmat, what this name means. Voyvoda, which was the name of the preceding missile, the one that the Soviets fielded in the 1980s, and which the Sarmat is going to replace, that refers to a kind of military or rank that a Russian official, or indeed a Polish official in medieval times would have. A Sarmat, by contrast, refers to the Sarmatian nation of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. The horsemen and women who galloped across the steppes of southern Russia and Ukraine, who fought the Romans, and some of whom actually enlisted to fight with the Romans, and whose womenfolk rode those horses and fought in the battles alongside the men, and who may have given rise to the myth of the Amazons. Well, that's what that refers to. By the way, both the Russians and the Poles, or at least some of them, claim that their nations have some genealogical connection with the Sarmatians, the ancient Sarmatians. I think most ethnographers are extremely skeptical about that, but there we are. That's the Sarmat. It's coming into service, perhaps not in 2022, but soon after, and it's only one system amongst many that the Russians are fielding, and there are no doubt going to be more to come. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to join us please also remember to support us via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar, and also to check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rumble, SuperU, but at the moment, especially locals. We have grand ambitions for what we're going to be doing there. We have massive opportunities which we're currently exploring. You'll probably be hearing live streams from me on that channel, on that platform before very long. And things of we have other ideas of a similar nature. All of these are coming. So do sign up for us on Locals. And also, if you also want to support us, please go to our shop, buy our wonderful products there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. And thank you for joining me today for this program about these perhaps rather dramatic subjects. And I look forward, as I said, to you joining me again, and have a wonderful day until then.